Hi. So we've been talking about World War One and all of the changes that European countries underwent during that time. We're going to now be moving on to post World War One. And as you can recall, during and after World War One in Europe, many countries underwent political, cultural, social, and economic change. And one of these countries to go through drastic political and economic change was Russia. So years of expensive wars and food and fuel shortages, as well as protests and inflations, came to a head in 1917. And in a series of events throughout 1917, changed Russia dramatically and would eventually shape the rest of modern world history. So we're going to be talking about what happened in Russia and how this relates to the rise of fascist and communist governments throughout the world in the later half of the 20th century. Okay, so the Russian Revolution. This was one of the most explosive political events of the 20th century. For centuries prior, Russia had been ruled by an imperial form of government, and this was headed by the Tsar or the Emperor. And the Russian Revolution was a violent revolution that marked the end of this Tsarist imperial rule. During the revolution, the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, took control and destroyed the tradition of imperial rule. And the Bolsheviks would later become the Communist Party, and Russia would change its name to the Soviet Union. So as you can see on the picture, there's the flag of the Tsar, which was the imperial rule from about the 1600s all the way to 1917. And on the right is the flag of the Soviet Union, which we'll be talking about later when we get into more modern world history. And we'll eventually get into what caused this revolution, but to begin, I'm just going to be introducing some key figures that will be helpful in us understanding all the events leading up to the Russian Revolution. So to begin, we're going to talk about the Romanov dynasty. So the Romanov were the ruling family of Russia from about 1613 until the Russian Revolution of February, which was in 1917. So that's a little more than 3 centuries of that family ruling. And up until the late 19th century, the Russian Empire actually practiced serfdom, which was a form of feudalism in which the landless peasants were forced to serve land-owning nobility. And if you were a peasant or a someone who was poorer during this time, you can see why there would be this animosity building up directed at these ruling families, this system of serfdom, and even the ruling emperor, and which was the Tsar and his family. So in 1861, the Russian Empire finally abolished serfdom, and the emancipation of serfs would influence the events leading to the revolution by giving peasants more freedom to organize and to protest. So on the right, you can see Nicholas II. So Nicholas II was the last Tsar of Russia. And when he succeeded his father in 1894, he had very little experience of government. So in 1894, Tsar Nicholas also married Princess Alexandra of Germany, and they had 4 daughters and a son. So that is the picture on your left. Those are the Romanovs. And in this family, Tsar Nicholas ruled, but however, his wife, Alexandra, had a very dominant personality and encouraged his weaker and autocratic tendencies. So she kind of played off of his insecurities as a ruler. And already as it was, Nicholas II was famous for mistrusting a lot of his ministers and advisors, but yet he needed help ruling, and so his wife kind of stepped in with her own ideas to kind of navigate that relationship and help him navigate the empire. So eventually, in March of 1917, Nicholas II would abdicate his throne after the Russian provisional government formed. And this Russian provisional government was a response to a series of protests against the government, which forced Nicholas II to abdicate. Okay, so another key figure leading up to these events would be Alexander Kerensky. He was a lawyer and politician, and he was one of the key figures between March and October of 1917, the year of the Russian Revolution. So Alexander Kerensky actually became prime minister of the Russian provisional government that took over for the Tsar. And under this provisional government, a liberal program of rights was established for people. So things such as freedom of speech, equal access to unions, the right to organize and strike, and equality before the law. These were all things that the Russian people did not have under the Tsar, which the provisional government instated. So Kerensky continued the Russian war effort. Russia was involved in World War I. However, a lot of the Russian people did not support this war effort. And the expense of war just exacerbated Russia's food supply problems. So that's why there was a lot of controversy over Alexander Kerensky's rule. And as unrest under his rule and the Russian provisional government's rule grew, peasants started to rise up, looting started, food riots erupted, and this all contributed to that just civil unrest leading up to revolution. And the last key figure we're going to be talking about is Vladimir Lenin, who was a Russian communist and revolutionary leader. He actually headed the Bolshevik Party. So Lenin actually grew up in Russia in a middle-class family. When he was a teenager, his brother was actually assassinated for plotting against the Tsar. So that created this distrust of government and really hatred toward the imperial family and the ruling class of Russia for Lenin. So he would eventually become fascinated with the works of Karl Marx and label himself a Marxist in about 1889 when he was a little older. And shortly after that, Lenin was actually arrested for engaging in this Marxist activities, things such as protests and illegal gathering of communist students, which wasn't allowed under imperial rule or the provisional government. And he was exiled to Siberia. So after his exile, he moved around Europe. He went to Germany and Switzerland, and he met other Marxists. And during this time is when Vladimir Lenin adopted the name just Lenin, and he established the Bolshevik Party. So when Lenin returned to Russia in April of 1917. The Russian Revolution had already begun. So in February or March of that year, there was a series of strikes and protests, which led to the formation of the provisional government and the abdication of the Tsar. So this is when, right after this is when Lenin comes back into the picture. He comes home to Russia after his exile. And eventually he would become the leader of this Bolshevik party, and would plot to overthrow the provisional government. So to Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the provisional government, even though they had started to give more rights to people and expand from imperial rule, what the provisional government did was not enough. They saw the provisional government as a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And if you're familiar with Marxist thought, the bourgeoisie is just the ruling socioeconomic class. And so Lenin and the Bolshevik Party instead wanted a more direct rule by workers and peasants. They advocated for rule of the proletariat or the working class. And this is why they started to gain a lot of support by the people, and gained a lot of power in Russia. And this would all come to a head in October and November of 1917, which was really the end of the Russian Revolution, and the beginning of a communist government in Russia. So we'll get into details later, but for now, these are just some background information and key figures that you'll need to know as we continue talking about the Russian Revolution.